Afghanistan doesn't ease you in. It hits you all at once. The heat, the altitude, the smell, burned garbage and diesel, and something older underneath it all that you can't quite name. Soldiers who've done multiple rotations through Kandahar Province will tell you the same thing. The land itself feels aware of you, like it's watching, like it has been watching for a very long time. The men and women deployed to the forward operating bases scattered across Zhari District in 2002 were not philosophers. They were not mystics. They were infantry soldiers and special operations personnel doing a job in one of the most kinetically active theaters of the post-9/11 war. They were tired. They were disciplined. They were skeptical by training and by nature, which is exactly why what happened in the autumn of that year is so difficult to dismiss. The Pashtun people have lived in the shadow of the Kandahar Mountains for centuries, long before British expeditionary forces marched through the passes in the 1800s, long before Soviet mechanized columns rolled down the Helmand Valley in the 1980s. The oral traditions of the region carry stories that are, by Western standards, impossible. Stories of beings that exist at the margins of human understanding. Creatures that predate the oldest mosques, the oldest written records, the oldest borders. They call them things that don't translate cleanly into English, but the description translates just fine. Enormous, upright, fast. The Kandahar Giant, Zhari District, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, October, November 2002. Official records from that period describe a series of patrols in the southern Zhari corridor as routine reconnaissance operations. Standard language. Standard classification. The kind of language that fills filing cabinets in a dozen different bureaucracies and means, on its surface, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The men who were on those patrols call it something else. They don't all agree on the details. That's the first thing you notice when you start pulling the threads of this story. The accounts diverge on specifics, the exact grid square, the exact time, the exact sequence of events. But they converge with an almost unsettling consistency on one detail, the size of what they saw. My name isn't important. What matters is that I spent a significant amount of time collecting soldier testimony, cross-referencing incident logs, and tracing the documentary trail of what multiple veterans of Operation Enduring Freedom have independently described as the most disorienting experience of their military service. This is not a ghost story. It is not mythology dressed up in military language. It is a reconstruction, as honest and as careful as I can make it, of something that happened to real people in a real war, in a place where the ancient and the modern have been colliding violently for a very long time. If you value real-world mysteries recovered from the fringes of conflict, stay with me. To understand what happened, you need to understand where it happened, and why. By the autumn of 2002, the initial phase of Operation Enduring Freedom had transitioned from the swift, violent shock of the October 2001 invasion into something slower and more complicated. The Taliban had been driven from Kandahar City, their spiritual and political headquarters, in early December of 2001. But driven out is not the same as destroyed. Anyone who has studied counterinsurgency knows the difference. The enemy doesn't vanish. It disperses. It waits. It uses terrain. And in Kandahar Province, there's a great deal of terrain to use. The unit at the center of this account was a Special Forces Operation Detachment Alpha, an ODA, operating out of a small forward operating base in the Zhari corridor. I'll refer to them by a designation that protects the identities of the individuals involved, most of whom have never spoken publicly about what happened. The team consisted of 12 operators, augmented at various points by conventional infantry elements from the 82nd Airborne Division, which had deployed significant forces to Kandahar in the spring of 2002. Their mission was what SF teams do: pattern of life reconnaissance, working with local assets, mapping Taliban movement corridors through the mountain passes that connect Kandahar Province to the Pakistani border to the south. It was methodical, unglamorous ORC, The FOB itself was austere in the way that all forward positions in that early period of the war were austere. Plywood and HESCO barriers. A diesel generator that ran 12 hours a day and sounded, one veteran told me, like a wounded animal. Cots that hadn't been replaced since the position was established. MREs that the team had long since memorized and no longer tasted. The smell of the latrine mixing with the smell of motor oil and the smell of the earth. That particular Kandahar earth that gets into everything. A fine, pale dust that coats your lungs and your gear and your food and never fully washes out. The team had been on the ground for approximately 60 days when the first incident occurred. 60 days of interrupted sleep cycles and 3-hour guard rotations and patrol schedules that kept every man operating at a sustained deficit. Sleep deprivation is not incidental to this story. It's important to name it because every serious investigation of anomalous soldier testimony has to account for it. The human mind under sustained stress, under prolonged sleep deprivation, in an environment of constant low-grade threat, is capable of producing experiences that feel, from the inside, absolutely and completely real. That is a fact. It is also a fact that 12 men in different locations on different nights, across a period of several weeks, produced testimony that is not easily reduced to individual fatigue or individual psychology. The accounts begin, as so many accounts from this region do, with the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of displacement. Kandahar nights are not quiet. The insects and the dogs and the wind create a baseline of ambient sound that experienced operators learn to read the way a sailor reads the ocean. You feel the pattern without consciously registering it. And when the pattern breaks, you feel that too. The first account comes from a team member I'll call Reyes, staff sergeant, 11 years in the Army at that point, including a prior rotation to the Balkans and a brief deployment to the Horn of Africa. Not a man given to exaggeration. Not a man who spooks easily. His words, reconstructed from a recorded interview conducted several years after his discharge, are as close to verbatim as I can present them. It was maybe 0 to 30. Could have been 0-300. You lose track after a while. The shifts blur together. I was on the north-facing position, up on the berm. My partner that night was a kid from the 82nd. Can't use his name, so I'll say Davis. Good soldier. Steady. We weren't talking because there wasn't anything to talk about. Just watching the grid. The first thing I noticed was the dogs. There was a village. A small callet, maybe 4 or 5 compounds, about 800 meters to our northwest. Every night since we'd been at that position, you could hear dogs, not barking necessarily, just present, that low, intermittent sound that tells you the dogs are awake and moving and the world is working the way it's supposed to work. That night, the dogs stopped, not gradually, not the way they fade out when it gets cold and they go inside. They just stopped all at once, like someone had hit a switch. I nudged Davis, didn't say anything. He'd already noticed. I could tell by the way he'd shifted his weight. He was leaning forward, looking northwest through his NVGs. I brought my own NVGs up and scanned the tree lean along the irrigation ditch that ran between us and the village. Nothing. Green nothing. Then the insect stopped. Now, I've been in enough bad situations to know the difference between my imagination and my instincts. Your instincts are quiet. They don't shout at you. They just redirect your attention, like a hand on your shoulder, turning you to look somewhere specific. My instincts were turning me south, not northwest where the village was. South, toward the Wadi, a dry riverbed, maybe 60 meters wide, that ran along our southern perimeter. We didn't cover the southern berm on that shift. That position was supposed to be handled by a 2-man element from the conventional force attached to us. I keyed my radio, kept my voice low and flat. Ghost 4, this is Ghost 2 actual on the north berm. You still got eyes on the southern Wadi? Over. 2 actual, this is Ghost 4. Yeah, we're good. Eyes on. OV. Copy that. 4. You notice the dogs went quiet? Over. Affirm. Hey, 2 actual, you have thermals up there? Over. Negative. Thermals are back at the TOC. Why? Over. Nothing. Disregard. For out. That disregard bothered me. In 12 years of Army service, I have never once heard a soldier on a 2-man guard position at 0 dark 30 in a kinetically active AO ask about thermal capability and then say, disregard. That's not how it works. If you're asking about thermals, you're asking because you saw something and you want to know if we can identify it from a distance. I told Davis to hold his position. I moved south along the berm toward a ladder that connected to the TOC. I got maybe 20 meters before I stopped. There was a smell. I know how that sounds. But there was a smell that I cannot fully describe except to say that it was animal and old and wrong in a way that made the back of my neck go cold. Not decomposition. I know what that smells like. Not burning. Not the usual smells of the AO. Something else. Something organic and enormous. And then I looked at the South Berm. And I saw the 2 men from Ghost 4 standing at the base of the ladder. Not at their position. Not watching the wadi. Standing at the base of the ladder. Completely still, looking south. Rifles at their sides. Not raised. Not in any posture of engagement or alert. Just standing and staring. I called their names. They didn't respond immediately. When the closer one, I'll call him Kowalski. When Kowalski finally turned around, his face was, I don't have a precise word for it. Blank isn't right. Emptied is closer. Like whatever processing was happening behind his eyes was fully occupied with something else, and there was nothing left over for his face. I grabbed his arm. I said, "What did you see?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Pause, 5 beats. The silence is heavy." It was standing in the wadi. It was standing upright, and it was looking back at us. Kowalski's full account, given separately and without coordination with Reyes, described the figure as bipedal, standing in the dry riverbed of the southern wadi. At a distance he estimated at between 100 and 150 meters. He estimated its height at between 12 and 15 feet. I want to stay with that for a moment, not to sensationalize it, to contextualize it. Kowalski was a specialist with 3 years of service. He had qualified as an expert marksman. He had formal training in range estimation, the ability to judge distance and target dimensions as a function of combat effectiveness. This is not a subjective skill. It is trained, tested, and repeatedly evaluated. A soldier who cannot accurately estimate range is a soldier who cannot effectively engage targets. Kowalski estimated 12 to 15 feet. He also noted one additional detail that he returned to repeatedly across multiple interviews over the years. A detail that appears in no official record that evening, because no official record that evening exists. The figure, he said, had one arm, not injured, not holding one arm still. One arm, as if the other had simply never been there. The incident was not reported up the chain of command. Not that night. Reyes made the decision, and he has spoken about this decision with considerable reflection in the years since, to classify what had happened as a possible enemy contact of indeterminate type, pending further investigation. He did not want to write the actual words in a SitRep. He did not believe those words would be received well. That calculation, the quiet, professional decision to keep the account contained, is one of the reasons this incident remained buried for so long. It is also, he told me, the decision he most regrets, because if the account had gone up the chain, perhaps what happened 6 weeks later might have been handled differently. Perhaps Reyes and his team were not the only ones. In the weeks following the Wadi incident, I've been able to identify, through a combination of veteran interviews, online forum posts from the early 2000s that were later deleted or archived, and one partial document obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request that was itself heavily redacted, at least 3 additional accounts from different units operating in overlapping areas of Zhari District during the same autumn period. They did not know about each other, not at the time. The FOB network in Kandahar in 2002 was not a community. Units operated in compartmented silos. Information traveled up chains of command, not laterally between teams, which means the consistency of what they reported cannot be explained by shared suggestio. And Account 2, Hendricks, Conventional Infantry, 82nd Airborne, approximately 4 kilometers northwest of the primary FOB, October 2002. The second account comes from a soldier I'll call Hendricks, a PFC at the time, later promoted, now long since separated from the Army. His account was posted anonymously to a veterans forum in 2007 and subsequently archived before the post was removed. I verified its authenticity through corroborating details that align with classified patrol schedules I obtained separately. Hendricks was part of a 4-man dismounted patrol that had pushed approximately 4 kilometers northwest of the main FOB to establish a temporary observation post on a ridgeline overlooking a known Taliban resupply route. Standard tasking. They'd done it a dozen times. On the third night at that position, Hendricks was on watch when his PVS-14, his night vision monocular, began behaving erratically. The thing about NVGs is their simple technology. They fail sometimes, sure, battery issues, impact damage, moisture, but when they fail in specific ways that you recognize. This wasn't any of those ways. The image was there, and then it was rolling, and then it was just white noise, and then it came back. And when it came back, there was something on the ridgeline to our east that hadn't been there before. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I've thought about it for years, and I've tried to give it every rational explanation I can think of. What I saw through the NVGs for approximately 4 to 6 seconds before they cut out again was a shape, upright, stationary, on the eastern ridgeline, which put above us, looking down at our position. The shape was large enough that my first thought was that it was a vehicle, a truck parked on the ridgeline, but it wasn't wide. It was tall, and then the NVGs went white, and when they came back, the ridgeline was empty. The morning after Hendricks' sighting, the patrol leader, a sergeant first class with 8 years of service, made a decision to check the ridgeline before RTB. Standard procedure when you've had a possible sighting of anything. You go look at the ground. What they found on the eastern ridgeline has been described consistently across every version of this account I've been able to locate. Impressions in the earth. Deep ones. Not boot prints. Not vehicle tracks. Impressions that were, by the patrol leader's estimation, roughly the dimensions of a large platter. Spaced at intervals that no human stride could account for. And they went to the edge of the ridgeline and stopped. Not as if whatever made them had turned around. Not as if it had moved laterally along the ridge. The impressions went to the lip of a sheer drop of approximately 40 feet and ceased, as if whatever made them had simply stepped off. The third account is the briefest, and in some ways the most difficult to dismiss. Account 3, Salazar, Special Operations Aviation. Support Element Eastern Zhari District, November 2002. Salazar was not infantry. He was a crew chief attached to a rotary wing support element flying night logistics runs between FOBs in the Kandahar corridor. His account is 5 sentences long. He gave it once to a colleague and has never repeated it publicly. The colleague wrote it down. That document reached me through a chain of custody I've spent considerable time verifying. The 5 sentences are as follows. We were on a night run, maybe 200 feet AGL, no lights. I was on the port side door. We passed over the southern wadi east of Zhari. I saw something standing in the wadi. I saw it clearly because the moon was up and the wadi was open ground. It was taller than our rotor height, and it watched us go over. 200 feet above ground level. Standard MH 60 rotor diameter, approximately 54 feet. Salazar's statement, taken at face value, describes something standing in an open wadi that was taller than a helicopter in flight. I am not asking you to accept that. I am asking you to sit with it. Now, before we go any further, I want to address the explanations that any rigorous analysis has to put on the table. Combat fatigue is real. Sleep deprivation produces hallucinations that are, from the inside, neurologically indistinguishable from genuine perception. Misidentification of natural terrain features, rock formations, shadow patterns, in low-light or NVG-enhanced conditions is a documented phenomenon. Enemy psyops, the deliberate exploitation of local superstition and fear to unsettle coalition forces, were an acknowledged Taliban tactic during this period. All of that is true, and none of it fully accounts for the consistency of these accounts, the physical evidence on the ridgeline or the aviation sighting. But there is one more layer to this story, one that doesn't come from the soldiers at all. It comes from the ground itself. The Pashtun oral tradition is not a monolith. It is regional, tribal, familial, stories carried in specific bloodlines, specific valleys, specific villages, but across the ethnographic literature on the Kandahar region. And there is more of it than most people realize, from British colonial-era accounts to mid-20th century anthropological surveys. One figure occurs with enough regularity to constitute something approaching a shared cultural memory. The figure has several names depending on the tribe and the valley. The closest phonetic approximation in English is something like dev, a word that translates imperfectly as giant, but carries connotations that go far beyond simple size. In Pashtun cosmology, a dev is not merely large. It is ancient. It is territorial. It is pre-human, a remnant of an age before the current order of things. It does not attack without provocation, but it remembers. It marks. And if it marks you, it does not forget. A British political officer named Carrington, writing in 1897 during the Malacan campaign, made a notation in his field journal, a notation that, for obvious reasons, never made it into his official dispatch, describing an account given to him by a local Malik, a village chief, regarding a creature that inhabited the mountain passes south of Kandahar. The Malik was, by Carrington's account, entirely matter-of-fact about it, not frightened, not attempting to frighten, simply informing the political officer of a geographic, hazardous way one might inform a traveler of a difficult river crossing. Carrington wrote, in the dry understatement of his era, the Malik advises that the southern Wadi is to be avoided after dark, as it is home to a thing of considerable size and considerable age, which has been known to follow those who observe the southern Wadi. 105 years separate Carrington's journal entry from the autumn of 2002. The location is the same. The description is the S. Aim. Draw from that what you will. Everything up to this point has been prelude. The sightings, the impressions in the earth, the aviation account, the Carrington notation. All of it was, in retrospect, a kind of accumulation, the way pressure builds in a system before something gives. The men at that FOB were being introduced to something, acclimated to it almost the way you acclimate to altitude, slowly enough that you don't notice a change until you're already deep inside it. By the third week of November 2002, the atmosphere at the FOB had shifted in ways that are difficult to quantify, but that multiple veterans have described in nearly identical terms. Quieter, the common areas, the Tilsi, the Chow area, the space around the generator where soldiers gather to decompress, were quieter. Men who had been voluble and loose in the way that soldiers are when they're comfortable in a position had become contained, watchful. Conversations that started didn't finish. Jokes that began didn't land. Reyes described it as a feeling of a unit that had collectively decided not to say a thing out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real. On the night of November 19th, 2002, a four-man patrol designated Ghost 6 was tasked with standard after-dark reconnaissance of the southern approach corridor, a route they had walked 11 times in the previous 6 weeks without incident. The patrol leader was a staff sergeant, I'll call Briggs. His three-man element consisted of 2 soldiers from the conventional force augmentation and 1 interpreter. A local national of the team had worked with for most of their rotation, a man they trusted. They left the FOB at 2100 hours. They were expected to establish an observation post at a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers south and check in at 0100 hours. 0100 came. No check-in. In a combat environment, a missed radio check is not immediately alarming. Comms fail. Terrain mask signals. Standard procedure is to wait, attempt contact on alternate frequencies, and initiate a QRF. Quick reaction force. Responsive contact isn't established within a defined window. The window at that FOB was 30 minutes. At 0130, with no contact established on primary or alternate frequencies, the ODA team's sergeant initiated QRF protocols for additional operators, plus a 2-man medic element. Stage for immediate departure. What happened in the next 90 minutes has been reconstructed from 3 sources. The personal account of the QRF team sergeant, a master sergeant I'll call Dolan, the partial radio logs from that night, and a brief, heavily redacted incident summary that appeared in a FOIA response I received after a 14-month wait. Approximately 60% of that summary is blacked out. What remains is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it is enough. The QRF element moved south from the FOB at 0145. Dolan was on point. He has described the movement south as immediately wrong in the way that the earlier sightings have been wrong. The silence preceding the sound, the baseline of ambient noise simply absent, the landscape stripped of its normal nocturnal texture. They reached the Wadi crossing at approximately 0215. We stopped at the near bank. Standard procedure. You don't cross open ground without scanning it first. I had NVGs up, so did Torres, my number 2. We scanned the Wadi from left to right. Full sweep, looking for heat signatures, movement, anything that shouldn't be there. The Wadi was empty. I gave the signal to cross. We moved in 2-man rushes. First pair to the far bank, second pair covering, then leapfrog. We were about halfway across when Torres stopped. I came up next to him. I didn't say anything. I just followed his sight line. There were tracks in the Wadi bed. Pause, 3 beats. Now, a dry Wadi in Kandahar is not soft ground. It's packed earth, gravel, rock. You don't leave clear impressions in it easily. I've crossed that Wadi a dozen times and never seen a boot print that lasted more than a day. The ground doesn't hold marks well. These marks were deep, and they were fresh. The edges were sharp, not worn. Whatever made them had been there recently. They ran north to south across the Wadi. The spacing, I paced it out later. The spacing between impressions was between 7 and 8 feet. That's not a stride. That's not any human movement pattern I've ever encountered or been trained on. I looked south, in the direction the impressions were heading, and that's when we heard it. I don't have a clean word for the sound. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a vocalization in any way I can relate to a known animal. It was low enough that you felt it more than heard it, in your sternum, in your back teeth, like standing next to a subwoofer, but directional. It had a direction. It was coming from the south, from the high ground beyond the ridgeline, and it lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then it stopped, and in the silence after it stopped, I heard Briggs. Briggs and his 2 soldiers were sitting at the base of the far bank, just sitting there, rifles in their laps, not in any ready position, facing south, not talking. The interpreter, Fazil, that was his name, Fazil was standing about 10 meters to their left, also facing south, and he had his hands at his sides, and his head was tilted back slightly, like he was looking at something above the ridgeline. I called Briggs by name. He turned around slowly, like a man waking up. He looked at me, and I could tell immediately he was not injured. His eyes were tracking. He was present, but there was something delayed about him, about all 3 of them, like the signal from their brain to their body was traveling through something thick. I asked him if he was hit. He said no. I asked him where the contact was. He said, and I need to be precise about his exact words because I've turned them over my mind every day for a long time. He said, it came down from the ridgeline. It stood in the Wadi. It looked at us for a while, and then it left. I asked him how long they'd been sitting there. He didn't know. Ghost 6 had been missing for 4 hours and 11 minutes. They had no memory of the first 3 hours and 46 minutes. Dolan made the call to RTB immediately. All elements back to the FOB. No further movement south that night. He did not call it in on the radio. Not because he was concealing it, he would say later, but because he could not construct a SitRep from what he had just encountered. There was no category. There was no box on any form he had ever been trained to fill that corresponded to what Briggs had described. The 4 members of Ghost 6 were evaluated by the team medic upon return. No physical injuries. No signs of concussion or trauma. Briggs and his 2 soldiers showed mild symptoms consistent with acute stress response, elevated heart rate, mild dissociation, impaired short-term recall. All resolved within hours. Fazl, the interpreter, did not speak for the remainder of the night. In the morning, he requested to be returned to Kandahar City. He gave no explanation. He did not return to the FOB. He never worked with coalition forces again. 3 days after the Ghost 6 incident, the ODA received new orders. The team was being redeployed, reassigned to a different AO in Helmand Province. Effective immediately. No explanation was given beyond operational necessity. In the context of OEF in 2002, this was not unusual. Units were constantly shifted as the theater evolved. But Dolan noted something that he has returned to repeatedly. The orders came not from the standard operational chain. They came from a different office entirely, an intelligence coordination element whose designation he did not recognize and has not been able to locate in any organizational chart from that period he subsequently accessed. The orders were verbal, confirmed in writing 24 hours later by a document that, when Dolan attempted to reference it in a subsequent inquiry years later, did not appear in any archive record system he could access. The FOB itself was decommissioned within 2 weeks of the team's departure, not handed off to another unit. Decommissioned, the position was struck, the HESCO barriers collapsed, the generator removed. Within a month, the ground looked, by satellite imagery, as if the position had never been there. I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for all incident reports, patrol logs, and operational summaries from the Zhari District FOB network for the period of September through December 2002. The request took 14 months to process. The response I received contained 47 pages. 31 of those pages were either fully redacted, solid black from margin to margin, or redacted to the point of functional illegibility. A single line visible here, a date there, a grid reference with coordinates themselves blacked out. What I could read was unremarkable. Routine patrol notations, equipment manifests, personnel rosters with names removed, except for one entry. On a page that is otherwise almost entirely black, in the upper right corner where the redaction appears to have been imprecise, a small window of legible text, perhaps 2 lines, that the redacting software or the redacting hand missed. The 2 lines read, confirmed by aviation element, no further investigation recommended, filed to be, and then the black again. No further investigation recommended. I've spoken to 9 veterans who were present in Zhari District during the autumn of 2002. Not all of them would discuss the specific incidents I've described. 3 of them declined immediately upon understanding the subject of the inquiry. Politely but firmly, with a directness that itself communicates something. 2 of them acknowledged the events in general terms, but declined to be recorded. 4 of them spoke at length. Of those 4, not one has offered a definitive explanation. Not one has claimed, in the years of reflection since their service, that they have fully resolved what they saw or experienced in that stretch of desert south of Kandahar City. Reyes, the first voice in this account, the staff sergeant on the North Berm who smelled something ancient and wrong, told me something in the final minutes of our last conversation that I've thought about considerably since. He said, "The thing that stays with me isn't what I saw. It's what it did. It didn't attack. It didn't threaten. It watched, and then it left. And I keep asking myself, what does it mean when something that size, something that old, looks at you and decides you're not worth the trouble? War is, among other things, an epistemological crisis. It strips away the structures that ordinarily tell us what is real and what is not. The routines, the social contracts, the comfortable assumption that the world behaves according to predictable rules. All of it goes. What remains is raw perception in an environment specifically designed to overwhelm raw perception. Noise and darkness and exhaustion and fear and the constant, grinding awareness that the next moment could be the last one. In that condition, the human mind does thing. I've been careful throughout this account to keep that fact visible, to name it honestly, because the alternative, treating soldier testimony as unimpeachable simply because it is vivid and consistent, would be its own kind of failure, a failure of rigor, a failure of respect, even for the men whose accounts I've spent considerable time with. They are not asking to be believed without question. What they are asking, what Reyes asked me directly in those exact words, is to be taken seriously. There is a difference. The Kandahar Giant, as it has come to be known in the narrow community of people who track these accounts, has never been officially acknowledged. It has never been the subject of a formal military investigation, at least not one that has surfaced in any accessible record. The FOIA documents remain largely black. The veterans who spoke remain, for the most part, unnamed. The FOB site in Zhari District is, as far as open source satellite imagery can determine, empty ground. None of that, in itself, is proof of anything beyond the ordinary opacity of military bureaucracy. Governments classify things routinely. Record or lost, misfiled, destroyed through negligence as often as through intent. The absence of a document is not evidence that something happened. It is simply an absence. See, and yet, the Pashtun Malik who spoke to Carrington in 1897 was not alarmed. That detail has stayed with me longer than almost any other in this investigation. He was not warning the British officer away in a manner of superstition or fear. He was informing him, the way an experienced guide informs a traveler of a geographical feature that must be accounted for and respected. The creature in the wadi was, to that Malik, simply a fact of the landscape. 105 years later, a Special Forces team and their attached conventional infantry elements arrived in the same landscape with the most sophisticated surveillance and targeting technology that the early 21st century had produced. Night vision, thermals, satellite communication, precision munitions, the full apparatus of a military superpower. And whatever was in that wadi watched them the way it had watched every army that had moved through that ground before them, the way it had watched Alexander's Macedonians, the way it had watched the Mughal columns, the way it had watched the British expeditionary forces and the Soviet mechanized infantry, and every other wave of organized violence that had crossed that particular stretch of earth across the long, accumulating centuries. It watched, and it waited, and it is, in all probability, still there. Dolan, the master sergeant who led the QRF into the wadi that November night, who found Briggs and his men sitting in the riverbed staring south at something they could not name. Dolan is not a man who uses language carelessly. He spent 22 years in the United States Army. He was not given to sentiment or to drama. When I asked him, at the end of our final conversation, what he believed he had encountered in Zhari District in the autumn of 2002, he was quiet for a long time, not uncomfortable, not evasive, simply considering. When he answered, he said this: "I've done a lot of reading since I got out. History, mostly. You spend enough time in a place like Afghanistan, you start wanting to understand it on its own terms, not just as a theater of operations. And what I've come to believe, not know, believe, is that there are places on this earth that have been accumulating human violence for so long that the ground itself has changed. That something lives in the residue of all that, something old enough that it doesn't have a category in any system we've built. I don't know what it was. I know what it wasn't. It wasn't enemy. It wasn't ours. It wasn't scared of us. And that, more than anything, is what I think about. We rolled into that country with everything we had, and whatever was in that wadi looked at all of it and wasn't scared. There is a category of experience that sits outside the reach of official language. It doesn't fit in a SitRep. It doesn't file cleanly into an incident report. It can't be briefed up a chain of command without transforming the person who tries to brief it into something the institution cannot accommodate. A soldier who saw something they shouldn't have seen, in a place that shouldn't contain what they're describing. So it goes sideways instead, into conversations between veterans at 0:30 when the families are asleep, and the particular silence of civilian house feels wrong in ways they can't explain to anyone who wasn't there. Into anonymous forum posts that get deleted. Into the careful, qualified language of men who have spent years trying to find the precise words for an experience that resists precision. Into accounts like the ones I've spent this time reconstructing for you. I don't know what was in the southern Wadi of Zhari District in the autumn of 2002. I don't believe anyone does. Not the soldiers who encountered it. Not whatever intelligence element issued those anomalous redeployment orders. Not the redactors who took their black markers to 47 pages of operational history. What I know is that 12 men, trained, disciplined, skeptical by profession and by temperament, encountered something in that desert that has not left them in the decade since. That the land they were operating in carries memories longer than any military campaign. That the Pashtun oral tradition, which has survived every invading army and every occupying force of centuries, contains a specific and consistent description of something that inhabits those passes and those wadis and those ridgelines. And a Victorian political officer, sitting in a field tent in 1897, wrote in a private journal that the southern wadi should be avoided after dark. Nobody warned the men of that ODA. Nobody told them what the ground remembered. War creates many ghosts. The soldiers who fight them carry those ghosts home, in the interrupted sleep, in the hypervigilance that doesn't fully switch off, in the way certain silences feel wrong in a way they can't articulate to anyone who hasn't stood a guard shift at 0:30 in a place that is older than the concept of borders. Those are human ghosts, made of human experience. Human los. But the southern Wadi of Zhari District suggests, with a consistency that I found genuinely difficult to set aside, that not every ghost in that landscape is human in origin. Some things were there before the first soldier arrived. Some things will be there long after the last one leaves. No further investigation recommended. If this account stayed with you, if it raised questions that you find yourself turning over, there are other stories like it waiting. From other theaters, other decades, other soldiers who encounter the edges of what the official record is willing to contain. This channel exists for those stories. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next one surfaces. Leave a comment below with what you think happened in that wadi. Not what you want to believe, but what the evidence, taken seriously and without wishful thinking, actually supports. I read every any. Until next time. Stay rigorous, stay curious, and if you're ever in a place where the dogs go quiet and the insects STO, pay attention to what comes next.